Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. I have received a few messages telling me, brother, make a video responding to the question, Islam is not a race. And I can assure you it is a motivation of a video I wanted to do in the future, and thank you for suggesting that. So that's why I'm doing this video. And you know, it is bizarre that people think that Islam is a race. There are people who actually believe that Islam is a race. And we know that Islam is not a race. And that's why it may be shocking for a Muslim, but I actually agree with the non-Muslims on this point, that they are right. Islam is not a race. Because there is no color in Islam. You could be black, you could be white, you could be red, you could be Asian, you could be African, you could be Caucasian. Islam is not a race. But that doesn't mean that the Islamophobe is still not a racist, because he behaves like a racist, and I'm going to show you why in this video. These are some examples I've collected over the years, so I like to share that with you. Here is a guy on the left, as you can see in the picture, a musician. His name is Richard Thompson. He has been a Muslim for 40 years and has never suffered an Islamophobic attack. But the guy on the right, he's a bus driver, Balwinder Jit Singh, has never been a Muslim in his life. He was attacked on his bus after being called a suicide bomber, and he was left disfigured. So the question is, are you really sure Islamophobia isn't racism because Islam isn't a race? Now you may say this is just one isolated case. No, it isn't. How many times you always see people dressed up in Islamic garments always getting beaten up, and there are many records of this, and I can put a hyperlink below this video and you can see article after article mentioned with sources and evidences posted on Wikipedia. And you constantly hear a woman's hijab being ripped off, being beaten, and there are Sikhs that have actually been beaten up thinking that they're actually Muslims. In fact, even their Sikh temples have been targeted because they look like Middle Easterners. You see, the Western academic thinks, oh look, because Islam isn't a race or Muslim isn't a race, therefore we can critique it any way, shape or form in the most vilest, abhorrent fashions to give themselves a green card to vilify Muslims as much as they want, as if religious discrimination doesn't exist. It does. There are many Western countries where vilification on religious premises can get you ended up in court and prosecuted. And the narrative is actually moving towards protecting Muslim minorities, because there are crimes against racism, there are crimes against sexism, there are crimes against homosexuality, there are crimes against everything, almost except hating on Muslims. But things are changing in the West, and we need to continue to develop our think tanks to stand up against discrimination of Muslims based on their religious convictions. And this is why you see Western academics and secularists, some of the branches of Islamophobes, who are trying to say, oh look, we need to stand up for free speech, we need to stand up for, what they're basically saying is, I need to be able to insult and denigrate and humiliate a Muslim walking in the street in any way, shape or form, so long as it's not violent, of course. But, I could poke the bear as much as I want. I could insult him and his religion into his face. But, it's interesting because these people, these Islamophobes and racists, They actually don't understand what hate speech is until you actually start insulting their Anzacs and you say something nasty about their Anzacs. Then they think, oh, I say they suddenly, a light bulb goes off in their head saying, oh, okay, now I kind of understand hate speech. Hypocrites. In saying that, Islam does allow constructive criticism in respectful terms, of course. Not the ones you see on social media with the vile comments and hatred spewed like a piece of vomit. It's interesting because when Westerners say Islam is not a race, but when a Muslim woman gets bashed in the street by a non-Muslim thug, they call it racially inspired attack. So I ask an Islamic critic, why is that? An Islamic critic usually says, well, that's just bad reporting. So then I ask them and say, Islam, to the Islamic critic, so what would Westerners report, how should they report this and entitle this attack? How about, we say it's an Islamophobic attack instead of a racially motivated attack? So the Islamic critic will say, we can't use the term Islamophobia because that term is a word created by fascists and used by cowards to manipulate morons, quoting Hitchens. So what do we call a Muslim being targeted then? That would be my response back to the critic. So what do we call an event that targets Muslims in an act of violence and abuse because of the faith they follow? So it's not a racial attack. It's not an Islamophobic attack. So what do we define it as? An Islamic critic will never be able to give you a response. And I find this point absolutely hilarious. Have you ever heard of an Islamophobe that says Islam is not a race or that Muslim is not a race, but they always tell Muslims to go back to the Middle East? Like, you don't hear them say go back to Indonesia or go back to Europe, although Indonesia makes up the greatest population of Muslims globally. Do you ever hear them say go back to Indonesia? It's usually go back to where you come from, but more specifically they say go back to the Middle East. Or they would identify Muslims as ragheads or desert camel herders, as if Muslims only lived amongst camels. So yes, Islam is not a race. Muslims are not a race, but it doesn't mean you're still not a racist. And this is a quote from Asadullah Ali. He says, so Islamophobes keep going on about how Islam is not a race and how the term Islamophobia is inappropriate in describing their criticism of Islam. I, for one, concede that the term Islamophobia doesn't semantically correspond with the phenomenon of anti-Muslim bigotry because Islam is not the same as Muslim. That said, what many still don't understand is that the reason anti-Muslim bigotry is still referred to as Islamophobia is because so-called criticism of Islam made by certain segments of society more often than not manifest themselves into physical and political violence against Muslims. If Islamophobes want the word to be gone, they need to stop harming innocent people because of what they think Islam stands for. Here is a comment by right-wing activist and politician Pauline Hanson. She says she finds a demographic of the names that are growing within society, and the word Muhammad actually tops the list of the most popular baby boy names. And Pauline Hanson writes, look out Australia, Muhammad tops most popular names in England and Wales. Keep going the way we are in Australia and Olivia, William and Jack will fall by wayside. So they're actually getting upset that the word Muhammad is becoming more popular than the name Jack and William. Brother Wissam actually writes, responding to this, now she exposes herself to be literally a racist. As all racist bigots say, we aren't against Muslims, we're just against Islam. But now they have a problem with the Arabic name. What's the problem if a Chinese name, or for that reason an Asian name, becomes more popular than, say, Williams? Unless you believe in white supremacy, and that's outright racism. So they can't deny racism here because the name Muhammad is an Arabic name, therefore it is racist. Although a Chinese Muslim can use the name Muhammad, it is still an Arabic word, therefore belongs to a race. It's not Chinese name, nor is it a Islamic name, because the term Muhammad came before the Quran came to Arabia. So yeah, it is racist. Pauline Hanson would vow to say she's not a racist and that she could criticize Muslims in Islam. But like I said, Islam is not a race. Muslims are not a race, but it doesn't mean that you're not a racist. Now, you might then wonder why, in short, racism is discrimination against another, at times race or another minority, ethnic, religious group. According to the Australian law, racism includes religious vilification and discrimination, which then is implied on you. You have breached the Australian Constitution just now, and hence you're not just a racist, but an un-Australian and an official criminal. Note, under the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act and its 1994 amendment, it defines race to include ethnic, ethno-religious or national origin. Under this, Muslims are referred to as ethno-religious group, just as Jews, Assyrians, Sikhs and Hunots are. If you're having trouble working that out, the definition of ethno-religious is, I'll break it down to you, its most simple form. It is an ethnic group which is united by a common religious, cultural, lingual and genetic background. It's how we're able to define the Holocaust as an ethnic genocide and not a religious one. The effect of amendment was, and I quote from the New South Wales Attorney General at the time, to clarify that ethno-religious groups such as Jews, Muslims and Sikhs have access to the racial vilification and discrimination provision of Act. Yet this may not cover the religious converts, but for those that can claim basically be ethnically Muslim according to the state law, you are being racist. And this is why it is defined as such. Because, yes, Islam is not a race, Muslims are not a race. However, the prejudice against Muslims, the way we actually see it portrayed, involves terms of racism. Possibly not technically, but close enough to be ruled as such. You know, I find it funny too, you know, when an Australian Muslim citizen, let's say he does a crime, yeah? Let's say there are 5 convictions, 5 people. One's name is Ahmed, the other one's name is Jamal, the other one's name is Musa, the other one's name is Mustafa, and the other one's name is Camille, right? Let's say all of these people, their names are mentioned in the media, and it states these 5 Australians have committed gang violence, for example. You know what an Australian critic would say in the comments? He'd say, oh, these are Australian names? Yeah, and they do. They actually say that. They say this shouldn't be identified as Australian. Why? Because their names aren't Australian names. So apparently, according to these jackholes, that to be an Australian, you need to identify as a white person, regardless if you've got a citizenship or not. You've got to identify as a white person, as a colonial-looking person, or possibly an indigenous person. Outside that, you're just something else. Even though we all came here by some particular means, whether it's by planes, ships, whatever. We've all come here from another country, but apparently these guys identify themselves as true Australians, true Aussies, are people who look white, apparently. And regardless if you got your citizenship or not, regardless if you're born here or not, you're not a real Australian. A real Australian is a white person. But then they turn around and say, we're not racist. You know, they say, we don't have a problem with Muslims, we have a problem with Islam. But see the problems they have with Muslims. You know, they don't say ban Islam, they say ban Muslim immigration. So yes, they are racist. Islam may not be a race, but they're still a racist. And here is another one from Asadullah Ali. He says, saying Islam is not a race is typically doublespeak. For don't condemn me for perceiving innocent Muslims the same as Nazis perceived the Jews. Yes, Islam is not a race, but you act like a racist, then people are going to treat you like a racist. Now, I'm not saying that every single Islamophobe is a racist, but I can assure you that all racists are Islamophobes, among, of course, the non-Muslims. Here's evidence of that. This is Blair Cottrell. He is from the right party, or more correctly, the right side of Australia. He justifies Europeans, or perhaps white African races, to be imported to Australia who have faced oppression. And so these people say, oh, how they're anti-immigrant, how they're anti-immigrants. Suddenly, their borders open up to white South African farmers. Why is that? Because when they say they're anti-immigration, what they mean is they're anti-dark-skinned Muslims. But soon as you have white complexion, white skin, and you're a South African farmer, then hey, you may even be a Muslim amongst them. You're suddenly a person that is now accepted in Australia. You know, all of these policies about banning immigration suddenly disappears because you're a white South African farmer. And of course, the same folks will complain Islam or Muslims are not a race, but they are racist. As you can see in a poll that conducted by Blair Cottrell, he says, should Australians take in white refugees from South Africa? He does a poll in his own group. 85% of them said yes, and 15% said no. Now, can you imagine if these people said, if Blair Cottrell asked his viewers, should we accept dark-skinned South Africans? The poll would be the opposite. But notice they're in favour of white South African farmers. These are the same Islamophobes that claim, oh, they're not racist, they're not racist. No, of course not. Yet you accept white South African farmers to come to Australia, but if they're dark-skinned, that's not accepted. So not only are these people racist, they won't accept even Christian dark-skinned immigrants to their country. But if you're a Christian white skin, then you're accepted into Australia. And then they call themselves non-racist. Why? Because Blair Cottrell actually thinks that they are dirty people by nature. Have a look at this. He says Africans in Europe, and he posts a picture of them being dirty, and then he shows Europeans in Africa, showing that they're civilized. And it's all clean. But of course they'd say, we're not racist. No. We just have criticisms against dark-skinned people and Muslims.